In the deepest corners of forests and mountains, silence can hide a deadly presence. In this video, you'll hear 6 gripping stories, from a farmer's animals disappearing without a trace to a Siberian hunter found frozen and bruised, a cyclist lost in the Scottish mist, a firefighter fleeing a massive shadow in Oregon, a photographer discovered under strange circumstances in Alaska, and a camper's terrifying encounter with unseen forces. These are 6 terrifying tales of survival and disappearance in the wild. The dense green shadows of the forest pressed close to the small farmstead on the outskirts of a forgotten Washington valley, where cold mists often curled through the towering firs like silent ghosts. There, Henry Caldwell lived alone in the weathered farmhouse passed down through generations, a sturdy man in his late 50s, hardened by years of waking before dawn to tend his crops and animals. His coarse hands had long grown accustomed to rough wood and stubborn earth, but lately, his nerves were frayed, worn thin by restless nights and the growing mystery that clawed at his sanity. It was a moody May in 2018, and Henry's chickens had begun vanishing. It started slowly, a few birds missing here and there, but over the past 3 weeks, the losses had multiplied. His coops were locked tight with iron latches, and his dogs, 2 large shepherd mixes bred to guard, patrolled the yard without fail each night. Yet each morning, he found gaps in the coop's defenses, feather tufts scattered like breadcrumbs, and fewer chickens clucking in the cold dawn light. On the surface, the problem seemed simple. Some wild predator was finding a way in. Henry's neighbors murmured about raccoons or the occasional coyote, and local wildlife officers nodded thoughtfully, but offered little help beyond advice to reinforce fencing and use stronger locks. But Henry knew better. His dogs behaved strangely after nightfall, their usual barking silenced. Their eyes flicked nervously into the dark woods without apparent cause, and the evidence around the coop told a different story. One gray morning, with fog still clinging low to the ground, Henry had gone out early, the air sharp with moisture and the scent of pine. His boots left prints in the soft earth as he approached the coop, eyes scanning the perimeter with the anxiety of a man chasing shadows. That day, he found something unusual: branches, thick and freshly broken, arranged in a loose, irregular pattern near the coop's entrance. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. The branches were snapped just so, some twisted, others bent awkwardly, as if someone or something had paused to leave a mark. Nearby, in the soft mud beneath the undergrowth, Henry spotted footprints. They were enormous, far larger than any bear tracks he had ever seen. At least a foot long, wide and deep with a heavy step, the prints led from the forest edge toward the coop and vanished again into the thicket. He followed them with a sinking heart, each step heavier than the last, until the prints disappeared beneath a fallen log. Henry's nights grew longer and darker with the mystery. He wrestled with his mind, plagued by insomnia and anxiety that gnawed at his reason. The local sheriff, a practical man named Briggs, visited after a concerned neighbor called. Briggs listened with a skeptical frown as Henry recounted the story of the missing chickens and the strange figure he swore he saw retreating into the trees one night, a large, hairy silhouette carrying 3 of his hens. The sheriff made notes but clearly doubted the tale, attributing it to stress and poor sleep. Despite the skepticism, Henry's fear mounted. He stayed awake late into the night, sitting on the porch with a flashlight and a shotgun, eyes straining into the darkness beyond the yard. The dogs lay quietly at his feet, unnervingly silent, their usual growls and barks replaced by restless pacing and low whines. Each sound from the forest, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent jolts of adrenaline through Henry's body. His pulse raced with the knowledge that whatever stalked his farm was neither ordinary nor predictable. One night, the tension snapped. Henry heard movement near the coop just beyond the yard's faint light. His breath caught as heavy footsteps thudded close by. slow and deliberate. He aimed the shotgun in the direction of the noise, heart pounding as the dark figure emerged briefly into the dim glow, a hulking shape covered in thick, dark hair. It moved with unnatural grace despite its size, and in its hands were several struggling chickens, their feathers flying in the air like broken promises. The figure froze when Henry shouted, then vanished into the forest in a fluid, powerful stride that broke more branches as it disappeared into the shadowed wilderness. Henry fired blindly after it, the shotgun's roar shattering the night's silence, but the creature was gone before he could see clearly. The dogs bolted after the noise but stopped abruptly at the tree line, whimpering and refusing to cross further. Their fear unsettled Henry more than the attack itself. Over the following days, Henry found more evidence. The chickens were gone, torn apart or missing, and the strange branch arrangements multiplied near the coop and along the forest's edge. The massive footprints appeared again, fresh and distinct, impossible to dismiss as those of a bear or any other known wildlife. Local wildlife experts visited, examining the tracks and unusual signs, but they shrugged, unable to identify the culprit. Bears left claw marks, coyotes did not break branches in such patterns, and no known animal left footprints of such size and shape. The farm's quiet isolation deepened the mystery. Without any neighbors close enough for regular company or quick aid, Henry faced the enigma alone, his thoughts twisting in spirals of fear and doubt. His history of anxiety and insomnia complicated matters. Some said he might be imagining things, that the pressure of loss and solitude was breaking his mind. But the footprints and the physical evidence were undeniable. One afternoon, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Sinclair arrived, carrying a camera and measuring tools. She walked the perimeter carefully, her eyes narrowing as she studied the branch patterns and disturbed earth. She speculated aloud about a bear possibly breaking branches to mark territory, but admitted the footprints did not match any known bear tracks in the region. Her measured skepticism matched that of the officials, yet her curiosity was genuine. The nights remained restless. Henry spent them on edge, eyes fixed on the dark tree line, heart racing at every whisper of wind. His dogs no longer offered comfort but seemed to share in his dread, their low growls and uneasy glances reflecting an unseen threat. One morning, Henry found the remains of his prize rooster, torn apart in the yard, blood staining the dirt like a cruel signature. It was a message, he thought, a warning from something that did not belong. Despite growing fear and exhaustion, Henry refused to abandon his farm or his life's work. Each day he secured the coop again, checking every lock and reinforcing fences, but the losses persisted. The mystery stalked him like a shadow, a dark presence just beyond human sight and understanding. Some neighbors offered sympathy, others avoidance. Henry's credibility was slipping in the quiet town, dismissed as a man broken by worry and sleepless nights. Yet his eyes, once steady and calm, now held a haunted look, fear mixed with fierce resolve. He knew the truth was out there in the dense woods, hiding behind ancient trees and silent shadows. The attacks continued sporadically, each night a gamble, each morning a reckoning. Henry's mind battled between reason and dread, between the world he knew and the possibility of something else, something old, powerful, and terrifying, lurking beyond the farm's fragile borders. The footprints remained, the broken branches arranged in strange patterns, and the chickens disappeared one by one, swallowed by the night. In the end, the question hung in the cold forest air. Was Henry's tale the ravings of a man undone by anxiety, or the desperate report of a farmer caught in the grip of a creature beyond human understanding? The truth lay buried in the shadows, where the trees whispered secrets no one dared speak aloud, and the mystery deepened with every lost feather and every silent night. Viktor Sokolov was a man carved from the wilderness, 62, hardened by decades in the unforgiving Siberian taiga. He had lived most of his life beyond the reach of roads and clocks. With a thick beard gone gray and hands like cracked leather, he had long survived off winter trap lines, stalking sable and ermine through forests buried in silence and snow. He trusted his instincts, knew the signs of weather and animals, and had never once failed to return from his roots. But that winter, something changed. He'd left his cabin near the Upper Yana River the second week of January 2004, dragging a sled with supplies and a rifle he called Old Friend. His plan was to check his northern traps, loop past a frozen stream the locals called Nimoy Ruchi, the Silent Creek, and return in 10 days. It was a route he'd walked every year since his 30s. That creek, though, was a place his father once told him to avoid. He had never believed in tales of forest spirits, but as he'd gotten older, the silence around that place had begun to press heavier on his mind. When Victor didn't return after 12 days, his brother Yuri raised the alarm. A search party was sent out, 2 younger hunters and an off-duty forest ranger who knew the terrain. They moved quickly through snow-bound woods, following sled tracks where they could, cutting through frost-bitten wind and the occasional creak of branches under ice. After 2 more days of searching, they found the sled. It was stuck in a drift, bags torn open, gear scattered, and Victor's tracks wandering into the trees without a clear path. 100 meters deeper into the woods, they found him. He was half submerged in a frozen stream, lying on his side, skin white with frostbite, lips blue, coat shredded. One boot was gone, the other soaked through. His hands were bloodied, fingernails broken, as if he'd clawed at something in the dark. His face was slack, but his eyes opened when they touched his shoulder. He trembled uncontrollably, lips barely moving, and whispered fragments they couldn't piece together at first. Words like "too big," "not a bear," and "it watched." He died 2 days later in a clinic, without ever explaining what had happened. But the bruises on his body told part of the story. Yuri insisted they examine the site. He knew his brother hadn't simply gotten lost. Victor knew how to move in a blizzard and had survived colder nights. But what confused them was the lack of tracks. The night he must have been attacked, new snow had fallen. Still, there should have been something. Prints, claw marks, blood. There was nothing. Not even the imprint of his own body from where he dragged himself back toward the stream. The torn pack had been found 200 meters from where he was lying. It was shredded, not chewed or clawed, but ripped apart, seams split and fabric hanging. His rifle was missing. The only sign of a struggle was the shape of broken saplings and snow scuffs near the edge of the clearing by the creek, as if someone had been thrown into the brush. Locals said the area near the stream had always been wrong. The elders spoke of a presence that moved through trees without sound, that watched but did not show itself, that struck not for food, but for reasons no one could understand. They called it Tot Samar, that which watches. The stories were old, passed down in whispers, always ending with missing hunters, found gear, and clean snow. Yuri returned alone a week later. He wanted answers. He brought a fresh rifle, a satellite phone, and a flare gun. For 2 days, nothing happened. The forest was still, suffocatingly quiet, and the cold gnawed at his skin. But on the 3rd night, just after sunset, he heard it. Something heavy moving through the trees without breaking a branch. No wind, no snow falling, but the faint sound of something shifting weight just beyond sight. The air changed. It felt wrong, like standing in a room with something that wasn't supposed to be there. He moved toward the stream where Victor had been found, sweeping the woods with his light, breath shallow, ears straining. The silence thickened. Then he saw the shape, tall, too tall, standing motionless among the birches. No eyes, no face visible, only a shadow too wide to be a man, too still to be an animal. Before he could raise the rifle, the thing moved. Not fast, not loud, but with a suddenness that made Yuri stagger. He fired once, the shot echoing like thunder. The shadow vanished. When he reached the spot, there were no footprints, no blood, nothing to show what had been there. But the tree trunks bore marks, long scrapes like pressure had bent them. The snow was packed, disturbed in a way that suggested weight. He didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he left and never returned. Back in the village, no one blamed Victor for dying the way he did. They said the forest had finally taken its due. But Yuri knew better. He'd seen what waited beyond the line of trees, something that didn't belong in any world they understood. Whatever had grabbed his brother had hands, not claws. Whatever had torn the pack and dragged a grown man 200 meters through deep snow had done so in silence. The authorities closed the case. They blamed cold, disorientation, and exhaustion. They said the bruises on Victor's neck and shoulders came from a fall, or maybe an animal attack. But Yuri knew that no animal in that part of the taiga had hands that left such marks, and none could move without leaving a single track in fresh snow. Some people kept their mouths shut. Others warned their children never to follow the stream. The forest grew quiet again, but not in peace, more like fear. Each winter, when the wind picked up and the trees groaned, hunters swore they could hear something breathing behind the pines, pacing just out of sight, waiting. They'd pause, grip their rifles tighter, and whisper under their breath, "Not a bear, not a man, something that watched." The wildfire had taken 6 days to contain, sweeping fast and violently through a stretch of forest in Northern California that hadn't seen rain in months. It moved like a living thing, crawling up ridgelines, swallowing acres, and turning entire slopes into smoldering ruin. 43-year-old Eric Dalton had been on the line the whole time. A firefighter since his early 20s, he'd seen enough loss to grow numb to it. But this blaze had cut deeper than most. He'd lost 3 crewmates when the wind shifted, and they'd been surrounded. He'd replayed that moment 100 times. Screams on the radio, the orange light turning white, the silence that followed. 2 weeks later, in July 1998, still reeling but deemed physically fit, Eric was sent back in for a containment assessment. His task was to check a section of the burn zone near the perimeter, miles from any road, quiet, buried under blackened trunks and gray ash. The others in the team took routes on opposite ends of the zone, and Eric moved alone into the eastern tract, relying on his GPS and radio to stay in touch. It was supposed to be routine. He walked through dead forest and scorched air, each step kicking up fine white powder that coated his boots and pants. The heat had passed, but the smell lingered. Burned sap, charred earth, something faintly metallic beneath it. Trees stood like skeletons, their bark stripped or blistered, branches reaching withered arms into a pale sky. There was no wind, no insects. The only sound was the crunch of his steps and the occasional creak of a weakened trunk. By early afternoon, he had reached the far ridge. He checked markers, scanned the area, and logged the coordinates. Everything seemed in order, but the silence had begun to weigh on him. It wasn't the stillness of a recovering forest. It felt hollow, like sound itself had been drained. His radio crackled faintly, but when he keyed it, he got nothing. No static, no voice, just dead air. He checked his GPS. The screen had frozen. He tapped it, reset it, and nothing. The time hadn't changed in 20 minutes. The numbers held steady, unblinking. Then he felt it. It was sudden, like pressure pushing through the air, making the hairs on his arms rise. He turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning between the trees. There was nothing visible, just standing trunks and ash. But something had changed. A presence, a weight. He called out, more to break the silence than out of hope for a reply. But the sound of his own voice seemed swallowed by the char. Then movement, far left, low to the ground at first, a shiver through soot and branches, followed by a crack, sharp and unnatural. He backed away, hand on his belt, eyes fixed on the source. Another crack, louder, closer. Something stepped into view from the edge of the blackened trees. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal he'd seen in over 2 decades of firefighting. Massive, upright, thick-limbed and covered in dark, matted hair that had been singed in places. The thing stood taller than any man, with shoulders wider than a grizzly's. Its face was barely visible through the haze, but what stood out were the eyes, deep-set and glowing faintly, like dying coals in the dark. They locked onto him, and then it moved. It charged. Eric ran. Adrenaline tore through him, propelling him through uneven ground and clouds of ash. He ducked beneath broken limbs, stumbled over roots, barely dodged a smoking stump as the sound behind him grew louder. Heavy steps, not rushed, but deliberate, like whatever chased him knew it wouldn't need to run long. He glanced back and caught a blur of movement. Something reached out, long, powerful arms, and he threw himself sideways, crashing into the base of a fallen tree. Pain shot through his ribs. He crawled beneath the trunk, scrambled up again, and ran without direction, mind blank except for the command to keep going. Branches tore at his arms, ash filled his mouth, and every breath burned. But slowly, the steps behind him began to fade. Not because he was faster, he knew he wasn't, but because it had stopped. He didn't understand why. When he finally stumbled back into camp hours later, soaked in sweat, gray with soot, and shaking from exhaustion, he could barely speak. The medics rushed to him, took his vitals, and wrapped blankets around his shoulders. He said fragments, charged, eyes like coals. It waited, but they looked at each other with quiet concern. He was told he'd been missing for nearly 40 minutes. His radio had been silent the whole time. His GPS tracking had gone blank, frozen mid-coordinate with no update. He was placed on leave by the department 2 days later. Officially, it was stress, cumulative trauma after the deaths of his crewmates. No one wanted to say he imagined it, but no one could explain what he claimed to have seen either. Not when the equipment had failed. Not when he'd been found with scratches down his back and a bruise shaped like a massive handprint across his shoulder. The incident was quietly filed away, but 3 weeks later, another inspection crew went into the same sector. 2 men and 1 woman, all experienced, all skeptical. They found nothing unusual until the final day, when they reached the edge of the eastern zone. In a small clearing, surrounded by the remains of trees scorched bare, they found a sapling, fresh, unburnt, somehow upright, in a place where nothing had grown since the fire. It had been jammed into the ash, as if planted with force. Balanced carefully on top was a blackened helmet, char melted, chin strap fused in place. There were no tracks in the soot, no signs of animals or people. Despite this disturbing sight, the crew concluded someone was playing a prank on them. There was no other logical explanation. As for Eric, never returned to the fire line. He moved north, changed his number, and avoided questions. His friends said he drank more and spoke less, but when asked what happened out there, he never changed the story. He didn't add to it. He didn't try to convince anyone. He only said that some things in the forest survive even fire, and sometimes they wait for when the ground is quiet, when nothing moves, and all eyes are turned away. That sector of the burn zone was quietly removed from future patrols. Not for any official reason, just a quiet understanding that it was better left alone. Callum Reed was the kind of man who never rode with others. He liked silence, mist, and the rhythmic thrum of tires on wet roads. At 35, lean and quiet, he worked as a forestry technician during the week and took to the backcountry trails on weekends. He lived alone in Fort Augustus and often cycled deep into the highlands, sometimes pushing 50 miles between landmarks. On March 26, 2021, he set out just after noon, hoping to follow a loop that cut through the wilderness before the late fog rolled in. The forecast had warned of shifting weather, but Callum didn't mind. He thrived in cold air and solitude. He wore his usual reflective jacket and gloves, strapped a light pack to his back, and vanished into the trees. The trail he followed was known among locals, but rarely used in spring. Too much rain, too much mud, and too easy to lose footing when visibility dropped. But Callum had been that way before, and knew the forest lines by heart. Hours later, He missed a scheduled check-in with a friend. He'd promised to text before dusk, and when the message never came, concern began to build. By morning, a search team was dispatched. They found his bike just beyond the trail fork that led toward a lake. It stood upright against an ancient oak, tires caked with wet earth but untouched otherwise. His helmet lay nearby, cracked clean down one side, the inside soaked from the fog. A single glove was found pinned beneath a heavy branch beside it, as if placed deliberately, not dropped. There were no human footprints in the area, only broad, sunken impressions in the soft ground, longer than any boot print, wide at the heel, tapering toward clawed ends. They led away from the bike and into the deeper woods. Investigators noted them, but recorded no conclusions. They marked the area, flagged it off, and expanded the search zone. No one found Callum's pack. No body, no blood. Over the next 3 days, dogs were brought in, but failed to track any scent past the edge of the forest. Choppers flew overhead. Rangers swept the slopes and ravines. But the fog returned each afternoon like clockwork. Thick, low, swallowing sound. And the forest floor remained clean, undisturbed, except for the strange depressions near the oak. Authorities eventually ruled the disappearance as an animal attack. A wandering bear, they assumed, since there was no native population. Maybe a large dog, or a wildcat even. The file was closed without answers. But those who lived nearby told a different story. The people of Canich and the surrounding highlands had heard things for generations, sounds not spoken of outside the pubs or firesides. They warned hikers not to venture into the woods when the mist came early, and never alone. Some claimed they'd heard deep breathing from just beyond the tree line on foggy days, like a furnace exhaling. Others spoke of low, guttural growls echoing across the glens when the light faded. Most dismissed the stories as tales meant to scare children or keep tourists close to marked paths. But the stories didn't stop. A month after Callum vanished, a wildlife ranger named Ellis McRae revisited the site. He'd been among the first to see the bike, and something about the scene had stuck with him. How untouched everything looked, how carefully the glove had been left, as if someone wanted it to be found. Ellis had worked in those woods 15 years. He'd tracked red deer and lynx, climbed into eagle nests, and bushwhacked across ice-covered ridges. But he'd never seen impressions like those found at the oak. That morning, the fog came early. He parked the ATV near the ridge and hiked in alone, carrying his field kit, a flare, and a sidearm he rarely used. As he approached the tree, he noticed the air was unusually still. The forest had sound even in silence. Birds, leaves, the distant snap of ice or trickle of runoff. But here, nothing moved. Even the fog hung too low, too thick. The tree stood as before, bark stripped in one place where the handlebars had rubbed. The ground remained scarred by the original impressions, but new ones had appeared. Fresh, deeper, like something had returned and stood there again, watching. Ellis crouched near the largest print and ran his fingers along the edge. It had depth, weight, not made by something leaping or running, but standing, waiting. His breath caught, and he straightened, eyes sweeping the surrounding trees. The fog pulsed with a strange rhythm, like it breathed in time with something hidden inside it. Then he heard it, a rasping inhale, followed by a slow, deliberate exhale. Not loud, but close. It came from the forest wall just ahead, where the fog was thickest. He reached for his radio, but static hissed through it before dying entirely. He didn't call out. He just backed away, step by step, never turning his back, hand on his flare trigger. Something shifted behind the trees, massive, tall enough to brush the lower branches. He saw no shape, just the distortion of mist against mass, the subtle bulge of a presence too large to be mistaken for anything natural. Then came another sound, bones or joints cracking, followed by the low groan of a heavy branch bending under pressure. Ellis didn't wait. He retreated quickly, breath locked in his throat, each footfall careful but urgent. The fog chased him, curling around trunks, following him down the slope until the ATV finally roared back to life and carried him away. He never returned to that section again. Over time, Callum Reed's name faded from public memory, but rangers and locals kept their distance from that trail. Unmarked on maps, it became one of those places you didn't talk about, but never walked alone. When asked why, people offered the same explanation: bad ground, strange air, or nothing much at all. But eyes always shifted when fog rolled in early, and search teams now carried flares by default. Some said Callum must have fallen, struck his head, wandered off confused, and succumbed to the elements. Others quietly believed something else had been watching that day from the trees, something that moved when the fog thickened, that left no trace of a man, only impressions too large to belong to one. And while the forest eventually grew back around that ancient oak, the ground beneath it never quite held shape. Prints returned after rain, strange in size and pattern, vanishing as soon as the weather cleared, always facing the trail, never leading anywhere else. Eli Monroe had spent his life chasing moments most people never noticed. A wildlife photographer from Washington State, he was known for going further than others, staying longer, waiting in silence for hours just to catch the flick of a lynx's tail or the silent stretch of an eagle's wings. He wasn't reckless, just comfortable with isolation. At 42, he had logged thousands of miles through North America's harshest backcountry. He planned his routes carefully, documented his movements, and carried 3 backup batteries for everything. In late September 2017, he flew into interior Alaska, alone as usual, aiming to photograph moose and late-season brown bears in the wild valleys. He hiked into the backcountry with a week's supplies and his gear packed into a single rucksack. His last message came 3 days in, a GPS ping from a ridge trail north of the valley, with a note to his sister that read simply, "Clear skies, fog rolling off the range, staying here another night." When his signal stopped updating the next day, no one panicked at first. Delays weren't unusual in remote zones, but after 3 days without contact, a search team was deployed. They found him seated upright against a spruce tree along the ridge, hands resting loosely in his lap, head tilted as if asleep. There were no signs of trauma, no lacerations, no blood, no broken bones. He wasn't frozen. Temperatures had stayed above freezing, but his skin was pale, lips slightly blue, expression unreadable. His boots had been removed, tied neatly together with their own laces, and hung over a low branch 6 feet above. The scene looked calm, staged almost. A few feet away, 5 stones had been stacked into a perfect cairn, flat, identical in size, centered. The moss underneath hadn't been disturbed, as if the stones had appeared that way. The tent, found 2 miles downhill, was zipped closed, but the flap had been sliced open from the inside. His pack was untouched. Food, batteries, bear spray, and camera lenses were still organized. Only the main camera body was missing. The coroner later reported deep bruising across Eli's upper back and both shoulders. The patterns suggested blunt pressure, not a fall, not an animal bite, but a force that had pressed down evenly, almost deliberately. He found no internal bleeding, no sign of strangulation, and no defensive wounds. Heart failure was listed as the probable cause. The GPS log revealed something stranger. In the final hour of Eli's life, he had made erratic movements, tight loops in a 50-foot area, back and forth, sometimes circling the same spot 6 or 7 times. Then, suddenly, the signal had stopped moving. Investigators marked it down as confusion, possibly brought on by fear or disorientation. The official conclusion was an animal encounter, perhaps a bear, maybe a moose. No prints were found, but that wasn't unusual in mossy, rain-soaked forest. Locals, however, had their own opinions. People from the small communities around the park's edge had long warned hikers not to camp near that ridge, not because of predators or weather, but because of how it felt. They said the trees stood too close together. The light bent strangely through the branches, and silence fell hard and fast once the sun dipped behind the peaks. A few elders called it the still line, a place where the forest no longer listened to you, but watched instead. There were other stories, of course. Hikers who got turned around, bush pilots who claimed their compasses spun near that stretch of land, hunters who packed up early after hearing something move around their tents without leaving a trail. But Eli's death gave new weight to those whispers. One ranger, James Keller, had gone up the ridge a week after the recovery. He wanted to take photos for internal documentation. He didn't stay long. He described the air as thick and not with fog or cold, but something heavier. He said the woods were too quiet, not even a bird call or rustling branch. He left in a rush, without taking any photos. Eli's sister, unable to accept the official explanation, returned to Alaska months later to visit the site herself. She stood by the tree, stared at the cairn, and placed a print of one of Eli's last photos in the moss. A bear cub, alone near a stream, looking off into the trees. She didn't speak to the press afterwards, but she told one ranger, quietly, that her brother had always believed there were things you could feel long before you saw them, and that some parts of the wild had rules that didn't match the rest of the world. She didn't stay the night, and no one else has camped near that ridge since. It was just after midnight on June 12, 2009, when the peace at Sleepy Lake RV Park shattered. The campground sat deep in the forested foothills of Central Oregon, 5 miles off the nearest paved road and nearly invisible from the highway. Tucked among thick evergreens and ringed by steep hills, the site was known mostly to locals. Quiet, rarely full, a place people came to fish, hike, and unplug for a weekend. That Friday, 12 families and a handful of solo campers had settled in, fires burning low as a chilly breeze drifted through the trees. At 12:18 a.m., the crashing began. Branches snapped like gunshots, followed by heavy rhythmic impact, deep thuds that shook the ground and rattled windows. Somewhere near the southern end of the park, metal shrieked and a tent caved in with a wet, tearing sound. Dogs began barking wildly, then fell silent, their whines muffled inside locked RVs. The lights flicked on, doors opened. People stepped out barefoot or half-dressed, staring into the black forest, but nothing could be seen beyond the trees. The destruction, when it came, was fast and targeted. A Class C motorhome parked near the wash house was dented along one side. Claw-like scrapes etched across the rear panel. An aluminum fishing boat, tied up behind a pickup truck, was shoved 3 feet sideways and partially folded in on itself. 2 tents were flattened, not torn by wind, but crushed inward, their poles broken at odd angles. A generator, bolted to a steel frame near a larger RV, had been torn off completely, its cables trailing into the dirt. Yet almost no food was taken. Coolers were ripped open, lids broken off, but most of the contents remained untouched. Camp stoves, pans, and utensils were thrown around but not carried off. Firewood was scattered. A few small items, lanterns, water jugs, plastic tubs, were missing entirely. One camper, a retired electrician named Dennis Holt, claimed he'd seen something just before the power cut out. He'd opened his blinds after hearing a low groan near his trailer. Through the condensation on the glass, he saw what he later described as a massive figure, upright, dark, and moving between trees with slow, deliberate step. It turned once, he said, and though he couldn't make out a face, he saw 2 faint reflections where eyes should have been. Then it vanished into the dark. No one believed him at first, but the damage was undeniable. By sunrise, the mood had shifted. The morning was crisp, the forest quiet again, and the campsite looked like it had survived a short, focused storm. Rangers arrived around 7 a.m., called in by a camper who'd driven out to the nearest signal tower. They surveyed the wreckage and asked questions. Most of the campers were vague. They'd heard noise, something big, but seen nothing clearly. Some mentioned the way the trees moved, shuddering from impact, not wind. Others talked about the strange silence that followed, how the forest, usually alive with bird calls at dawn, had stayed hushed. The rangers took down note and inspected the scratch marks on the RVs. They looked at the footprint, though none matched a clear pattern. The ground was too dry in some places, too soft in others. Some impressions were long and narrow, others wide and shallow, and most didn't lead anywhere. One ranger said it looked like whatever moved through the site hadn't walked in from the wood, but had emerged from inside it without warning. Their conclusion came later that afternoon. Most likely a bear, maybe more than one. That explanation didn't sit well with the people who'd been there. No food was missing. The damage was too precise, too powerful. The generator alone had been torn free with more force than a bear could easily manage, and no one had heard the snuffling or huffing common to curious wildlife. The sounds were different, harder to place, lower in pitch, more like pressure waves than vocalization. Dennis Holt, the man who claimed to have seen something, left by noon. So did most others. Some packed in silence, others moved quickly, as if trying not to draw attention. No one stayed for the second night. By the time evening settled over the site, only one RV remained. An older couple who said they weren't afraid, just skeptical, but they even left before midnight. The forest that night seemed to pull tighter around the campground. Trees pressed close, and the clearing felt smaller than it had the day before. Shadows fell earlier. The mist came faster, and not a single dog barked. Back in town, word spread slowly. The event didn't make the news. No one had been hurt. No one filed an official complaint. But among locals, the story took root. People who had grown up in the area said the land had always been strange. Some trails led nowhere. Some nights, sounds came through the trees that didn't belong to wind or animals. They spoke of the hills around Sleepy Lake, how they seemed to fold in on themselves in places, how compasses spun near the old fire road, and how birds rarely nested close to the southern ridge. One man, whose uncle worked for the local Forest Service, said the site had been cleared once in the 70s after a series of incidents. Tents crushed, campers gone missing. The official record said storm damage, but no storms had been recorded those nights.